What I want to make clear is that when you start an application, you first want to think in terms of the static elements of the site. That means we want to think about the structure in terms of the HTML. That's what we want to build out first. We also maybe want to add any styles, any CSS that those HTML elements might need. And only then, once we have the basic structure, do we start thinking about what functionality we need, what data we want to keep track of, things like that. So we're going to start building out our different components, and we're going to create a basic structure for our app first, and then move on to actually working with data, using our hooks, etc. So let's begin by clearing everything out of our app component. We're still going to just return some HTML, some JSX, but for right now, let's just return a div with the text app. And now we can begin creating more components here within our source folder. So app is usually placed in its own file, just like each component that we'll be making. And we put that directly within the root of source. So we can create a file called app.js. We want to make every file that holds on to a component, that stores a component, a JavaScript file. You might also see the extension as JSX, which is valid as well, but we just need to make it JS. The X is not necessary. And we also want to capitalize the name of this file. And this makes sense because it corresponds with the convention for naming components. So we'll make an app.js file, and we want to copy the app component that we have here, paste it in app.js, and then for every component file, we're going to need to import React so that we can use JSX. So we can copy our import React line, and finally we want to export our app component from this file with export default app. And then we can import it in index and still use it as our root element. So we'll import app from the same folder at the same level, so that will be /app. So let's save and make sure that this works, and we see the text app, so it is. Now all of our other components aside from app are going to be placed in a components folder, and that's because all of these components are going to be within app. They're all going to be children of the parent app component. So let's create a folder in source called components. So let's select new file and first add login.js, and we can once again copy what we have in app, and here we'll make this function component login with the text login. Make sure we export the login component. We had a header component, header.js. We'll call that header the text header and export it. We had a component to create posts called create post. So we'll make that with its text. And this just makes it very easy to be able to see within our page all of our different components and how they're laid out. We'll be giving them their real structure in just a bit. And since we have create post, we're going to have a post list component. And this post list component is going to be composed of individual post components. So now that we have all of our components created, we can save all of them. We hit this Save All button, and let's flip back to the appearance of our app. Let's think about how a user is going to navigate through our application. What component are they going to see first? Well, if they're not logged in, they're going to see a login component. That's going to enable them to do so. And that's just going to consist of a simple form with an input that allows a user to provide their username. It's going to mirror more sophisticated authentication that we're going to be doing in our final project. So we want to set up a conditional here. If a user's not signed in, if they've not logged in, we show the login component. But if they have, we want to show them the app itself. So let's start by building out our logic for this within the app component. So if we have a user, if someone's provided their username, and let's represent that now with just a simple variable, we'll declare with let. If we have a user, and they've provided their name, will show the app. But if not, so if not user, then we want to show and therefore return the login component. So let's import from the components folder login. So login is going to come from /. We're going to go from app into the components folder /components /login. And so here, if we don't have a user, we'll return login. And when we save this, we still see app. That's because we do have a user. But if we don't, say for example the user was an empty string, which is a falsy value, we're going to see login. So let's build out the actual structure of login. So we'll go there, go to that file, and we're not going to be doing things perfectly in order. We're not going to be doing the styling just yet at this step. We just want to create the basic HTML structure, the basic components hierarchy that we want to have within our app. And the reason we're doing this is so you can focus on how things are arranged, how they're ordered, without being distracted by the styles of any sort. So login is going to consist of a div. And this div will have for its children first an h2 with the title text login. Then we're going to have a form, as I mentioned. Within it will be an input where we'll have the placeholder text, input username, and underneath the input we'll have a button which will be of type submit. So users will be able to submit this form, and it's going to have the text submit. So if we save, we can now see our very basic form. And once we have the structure here, we can start thinking about state. What state we want to hold on to, what's going to be preserved from this login component. Well, we already saw an indication of this within app. We want to keep track of the user. But what's a little bit challenging about this is the fact that we're interacting with the state here, meaning we naturally want to keep track of what the user's typed into the input here within login. But in the past, we've only been dealing with local state. We've only been dealing with state that is located within a given component and we haven't needed to pass it up somehow to a parent component. Well, first let's see how to track our state locally, meaning the username state within login, and we'll see how to then get it up to our app component. So first we want to use some state with the useState hook. By default, this will have an empty string as its initial value. And let's call this piece of state username. And the setter to update it will be set username. So as compared to before, we had an onChange that we passed a function to handle the text that was typed in and store it in state. Now we're going to store the username data when the form's submitted. So we're still going to keep track of what a user's typed in with onChange. So we can include an onChange here on our input. We get the event, and we can use an inline function to update the state with set username and pass in event.target.value. But when a user submits the form, so when they type something into the input and hit submit, we want to have that piece of state passed up to our app component. So first of all, we have to handle a new type of event, meaning when a form is submitted, when we either hit the submit button or we hit the enter or return key. So on the form, we're going to have a new event handler called onSubmit, and we'll pass this to a function called handleSubmit. And we'll create that above the return. Now handleSubmit is going to get an event object, and notice the default behavior when we submit a form. The page refreshes, we do a full page pushback as if we were sending that data to a server. We don't want the page to refresh here. We want to prevent the default behavior, so we use a method off of the event called event.preventDefault. So when we hit submit, nothing happens. we no longer get the page refresh, which is not what we want within a single page app. We want JavaScript on the client to control everything. So a user types into the input, we're setting the username, we're updating its value, and when we submit the form, what do we want to do? We want to put the username, the new username state, up a level. We want to what's known as lift our state up. Instead of having this variable, we know that we want to use state within app. Again, we'll have a default value of an empty string. And this piece of state is going to be called user, like we had before. The setter will be set user. Now here's the trick. We can take this set user function and pass it down to login as a prop. We can pass any value as a prop, including functions. So we'll make a prop called set user, and we'll provide the value as set user. So now within login, we can access the props object. And to make this even easier to access and make it more declarative, to be able to see immediately what's on that object instead of looking at props every time, we can use ES6 object destructuring to insert this set of curly braces and grab the props that we want, in this case set user. So we can immediately get the property set user. So that enables us to go into handle submit, call set user, and pass it the updated username value. So now when we save app and log in, we see our login, we insert our username, we hit submit, and we see our app component. Perfect. So this state, this username state, is being lifted up from this login component with set user by providing it as a callback via props. So then our user state is updated and our app re-renders to show the app itself. So once a user logs in or provides their username, we're shown our app component. Now the first thing that we're going to include within app is a header component. So let's find header. And the purpose of this is to greet our user, to display their username that they provided, see what they logged in as well as include a log out button. So they'll be able to log in and log out. So first of all, we want to say welcome user. And we want to insert their user name right here. And right after that, we'll include a button with the text log out. And with this button, we want to log out our user by setting user back to its initial value of an empty string and therefore showing our login component. So first of all, let's bring header into our app component to be returned. So import header from components header, and we'll insert it in our div. Note that we don't always have to use a div if we're not applying any styles. We just want to return multiple components. We can again use a fragment. So we'll include our header here. If we look back at our header, well, first of all, let's just save and make sure that this is working properly. When we log in, we might want to include a default value of something so we don't have to keep logging in every time. So we see welcome user, great, but we want to actually show the user's username, and we want to make this logout button functional. So we want to pass through the user data to header. So again, we'll make a prop called user. We can use within header our destructuring trick to grab the user prop, and then we can just include a set of curly braces to interpolate that value. Pretty simple. And the next step will be to log out our user by setting the state in the parent component to an empty string. So what do? Well, we can use our trick of passing our setter function down. So again, create a prop called set user, and within header we'll destructure that as well. And on the button, you can add an on click, include an inline arrow function because we want to pass an argument to set user, and to set user will provide just an empty string. So now if we hit log out, we see our login component. Perfect. So next, since we have our user state being stored in app, we also maybe want to show our user in the title. So to be able to interact with the title element, to be able to interact with the DOM here, that is the outside world, what hook do we want to use? Well, we want to use useEffect. So back within app, right underneath our state, our user state, we can add react.useEffect, add our effect callback, add our dependencies array. What is this effect callback going to sync with? What do we want our hook to sync with? Well, we want it to sync with our user piece of state. So this will enable us to set our title. You can set document.title to our user's name. But note that when we log out, we see just localhost 3000. Let's make that a little bit better by including a ternary here, a conditional. You can write this using a ternary, or maybe you could use an if statement. I think a ternary is a bit shorter here. We can check to see if there's a user, and if there is a user, we can set the title to the following string using template literals. Since this is a social media app, we can say this is the user's feed. Their feed of posts that they see. Otherwise, we can just say, please log in order to see it. So when we're logged in, we see the user's feed, reads feed. When we log out, we see please log in. Now, when a user is logged in, they should be able to create their own posts. Let's move on to creating posts. And the way we're going to do that is with the create post component. And this is going to be placed right underneath the header in our app component. So again, let's import create post from the components folder. We'll place it right under the header. And as for what it's going to consist of, and by the way, a quick trick to be able to go into any file is to hit Command and then click on the component, and it'll take you right there. You don't have to keep finding it within your file explorer. I know that can get kind of tedious. So what is create post going to consist of? Well, again, we're going to have a div, and first we're going to have an h1 title, and as for the text, that'll be create new post, and underneath we'll have a form once again. And this will consist of a couple of inputs. The first will be a text input, so we'll have an input of type text. And for this input, we'll have a placeholder. We can say add post content. And underneath that, we'll have an input for a user to provide an image. So this will be of type file. That's all for now. We'll keep it simple. And we're going to have a button, again, of type submit to submit our form with the text submit post. So again, pretty simple. Let's save both files. And just to show you another shortcut, you can use Command, Option, and S in order to save multiple files immediately. So back within app, we now have our header and then our entire create post component. If we go to our DevTools, we go to our Components tab, we see our app, header, and create post as our entire component tree. So now we want to start working with post state. Previously, we were just working with user state here within app. Now we'll start thinking about our post. Well, here we have an input for post content, the text, and one for our image. So we'll need to have some local state within create post to store those. So we'll use some state. The first will be for the post content. We'll start with an empty string, and we'll call this content. Setter will be set content. And then for the image, we'll create some image state. The image will be provided as a file. So since that will be an object, we want the default value to be null, and we'll call this state image and setter set image. Now we can update our state with on change on both of the inputs. can add the onChange for the text, getting its value from event.target.value and passing it to set content. And for input, this will be a little bit different. For the onChange, we'll get the event, but instead of getting it from event.target.value, it'll be still from the event target, but it'll be event.target.files. And files is actually an array, or really a file list. So we want to get the first element from this file list, and we can do that with the bracket syntax and say we want the 0th or the first element, the element from the 0th index, and we want to pass that to set image. Now, to see that our state's being updated correctly, once we actually provide some text here and we choose a file, once we choose a file, we want to see that state's being updated correctly. So for right now within our component, let's just spit out both of these values onto the page. So underneath our form, we'll just interpolate the content value, as well as, let's actually include this within a paragraph element. We'll drag that in there, and we want to use an image element to display the image. And for the style of that, we want to format this a bit. For the style of that, we'll set the height to 100 pixels. And note that when you're using pixels, you can actually use a number like this. You don't have to provide it as a string, although you could provide it just like this as 100px. That would be the same. So we could set height to 100, width to 200, and the property object fit to cover to make sure it fills up the space, this fixed width and height, without changing its aspect ratio. And then we'll set the source. Now, to be able to display an image using an image file, we need to say url.createObjectURL from the entire image file. So when we save, let's try providing some text, and oops, we get an error, failed to execute createObjectURL on URL. No function was found that matched the signature provided. Well, what happened here? Again, when our component rendered, it immediately ran this function. It immediately tried to create an object URL from the image, which was by default null. So when do we want to display the image? Well, we want to display an image when we have one. Otherwise, we don't want to display anything. So this is a good use case for our AND conditional. Remember that along with our ternary conditional to display an image when we have one, otherwise nothing. We can wrap this in a set of curly braces and say image, and if we have some image state, then we want to show the image element. So now when we save, let's try creating some post content, some random text, choose a file, choose an image, and we can see it here. Great. And there's one other piece of state that we want to pass down. We want to pass down to create new post. We don't have it here within the component, but we also want to display who this post is from. So again, we want to pass down user state. So let's go back to app. We have our user state here. We'll create a user prop and set it to user here on create post. Again, we can destructure the user prop and use it where we like. Now we want to use these three values, user, image, and content, when a user submits the form. So let's get rid of these two elements at the bottom. We don't need them anymore since we know that state's being updated correctly. When a user submits the form, we want to create a post. So again, we want to add the onSubmit to our form and connect that to a function which we'll create as handle submit. We'll make that locally, and we'll get our event. Again, we'll make sure to call prevent default. And to create our post, we'll create a variable called post. A good idea would be to store all of these values on an object. So we'll have a property content that's going to be set to what we have stored in state as content. We'll have an image property set to image, and we'll also have user. It'll be set to the value user. Now we've been using a lot of ES6 features here, a lot of modern JavaScript features, and another neat feature that we can use here to cut down our code whenever we're creating an object where the property's name is the same as the value, the variable value that we're trying to set it to. Since each of these are the same, we can condense them into just a single value using this object shorthand syntax. So this is exactly equivalent, the exact equivalent of what we had before. So we're creating our new post, but again we're faced with the question of what do we want to do with it? Well, instead of displaying our component here, our new post here within the create post component, we want to display it within app, namely in a new component, post list. So again, we're in a position where we want to lift the state up and have our post state be here in app. So we'll make some new state, and by default let's make this an empty array. We're going to have a list or array of post objects, and for our state variable we'll call that posts, and the setter will be set posts. So using our callback pattern, we'll pass set posts down to create post as a prop. We'll receive that. We'll destructure that, set posts, and then we want to add the post onto the existing list, the existing array of posts that we have here. So how do we create that new array? Well, we're going to need to pass down one additional prop. We're going to need the previous array of posts. So we'll have to create a new prop, posts, and we'll pass that array down, destructure it. And here let's create within handle submit an array, a new array called new posts. And what we want to do is whenever a post is added, we want to add it up at the top of the queue, up at the top of the array. So we'll make a new array here. We want to put the new post up at the front in the first position, and then all of the previous posts that we had, we want to insert them into this new array and just spread them in at the end. So to spread out an existing array into its composite elements, we can use the array spread operator, just like we used the object spread before. So we'll spread in posts, and now we have an array that we can use to update our state with by passing it to set posts. So now we can save both files. We'll add some state, some content, and we'll call this first post. We'll choose a file. And note that this is a very convenient thing about React DevTools, is that we can see here directly in this hooks area. Can you see the fact that in addition to all the props that we're getting, the empty posts array, we're seeing that it's empty, which reflects what we see in the UI, our user's name that's going to be added to our first post. But in addition to that, we have our content being saved and displayed, as well as our image data being stored here for us to review. And when we hit submit post, it seems like nothing happens. But if we look at props, we see here that when we expand this, the first element, the first object was added to our posts array. We're just not seeing it because we're not generating any JSX, any HTML in our UI underneath anymore. But we still have that new post added to our posts array. And we can use that within app right underneath create post. We know how to iterate over a list of data to turn them into individual JSX elements. So we can take posts.map, and for each post we can return first an image, and once again we can wrap this in a fragment. We want to return our image first, and that's going to come from post.image. We want to make sure that we have one, so we'll use our and conditional. If we have an image, we'll show an image element, or again, like we had before, like we were displaying within create post, we set the style to have a height of 100, width 200, and an object fit of cover. The source we set to url.createObjectURL and pass in post.image, that entire file. And maybe we can provide some alt text if this doesn't show up correctly. We can call this the post cover image. And then directly underneath that, we'll have a paragraph where we display our content from post.content. And finally, we'll have a div with just the text user for the user who posted it. Now you might see this red squiggly line here, and that's because I mistakenly put the paragraph and the div within this conditional. We don't want to do that. But one additional problem that we're going to run into if we hit save, well, first of all, our state is going to be reset. Unfortunately, this is the default nature of our development server, so we'll need to add another post to be able to actually see it when we submit it. We see that this list works, and we see that all of the data is being added to our UI. But one issue that we're going to be running into if we take a look at the console is that we're not providing our unique key prop. We're trying to use a fragment here, but with the shorthand syntax, it's impossible to add a key. To be able to use a fragment and add a key, we can use the longer version of React.fragment. And to be able to get the key, once again, since we don't have a unique ID, we can grab the second parameter from the second parameter of map, the index of each element in the posts array. So now we can set key to that post, the given post index. And again, when we add a post, that error will go away. But note another small issue here. After we submit a post, the state isn't cleared out from our form, which is what we'd expect by default in any application that we'd be using. So we can just hit submit post again and the same exact post is created. We want to clear out this state. We want to clear out the state from the input as well as the state from the file input, the content state and the image state. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's head back to create post and let's introduce a new concept here. The way data is being tracked here within create post is the following. A user provides some data, some text into an input, or they provide an image, and we're storing it in state, and we're doing something with that state. And this is fine. This is appropriate for a lot of components and a lot of forms. But a better pattern to have in many cases, especially when we want to do important things like clear data, clear state out of our input, is we want to make this a controlled component. So what is a controlled component? Well, this is where we have a form, usually they're form components, where the input, its value is being controlled by state. In other words, it uses the state that ultimately each input updates as its source of truth. Meaning, when we clear out the content state, when we set it back to its initial value, the input is cleared out of its value too. Its state, the data it holds, is controlled by state. So we can see this here if we try to, with our uncontrolled component, at the end of handle submit, clear out the input by calling set content and providing an empty string. What do you think is going to happen when we do this? Well, when we save, we try to submit another post. We don't have to include an image every time. We hit submit post. Even though we set content back to its initial value, the input's not cleared out. We want its value to be controlled by state. And the way that we do that is by adding this value attribute to our input, and we can set it equal to whatever state is, whatever it's updated to be over time. So we set the content inputs value to content, and look at what happens now. When we add some post content, hit submit, immediately it's cleared out once we updated its value. So this is the benefit of having a controlled component. But note that not all inputs are so easily controlled. For example, we can't do the same with a input with the type of file. It's not going to work if we try to set value to the image state that it's updating, and then try to clear it out by setting image to null at the end of submitting our form. That's not going to work. So we want a way to change the value that this input holds without using the value attribute. This is another great use case of a ref, to be able to reference the input. Now we're starting to see the great number of use cases that refs have with input elements. So again, to use a ref, we use the use ref hook, call it up at the top, and we're going to call this ref our image ref, or we could also call it our image input ref to be more precise. Our component will mount, and then we can set the ref attribute to image input ref, and that means within handle submit we can use this reference, specifically the current property off of it, which as we mentioned is our kind of box that we can mutate at will. We can take the input, current, and its value, remember the value property, and mutate that or set it to an empty string. That'll just clear it out. So let's try this again. We'll provide some content, an image, and when we hit submit, both inputs are cleared out, our content and image inputs. So in the end, for our app, we want to have, if we look at our component tree again, we want to have app, within app, the header, create post, and then the post list component here. That'll serve as our list of posts. Right now, we're just displaying them directly within app itself. Instead of doing that, we want to pass our post down to post list. So to fix this, and we'll see in just a minute the benefit of doing this, of including this within its own dedicated component. To move over all of this to post list, we want to first import it from components post list, and we can comment this out and display post list underneath, and we want to pass post list the entire array. So we'll create a prop of the same name, and we can take all of the JSX that we had here, we can copy all of that, remove our comment, and paste it in to be returned from post list. Now since all of this is being immediately returned and not within JSX, we can remove the curly braces around everything. So now if we save, we're going to get an error, and that's because we need to grab the post prop as well as the user prop. And note that I made a mistake here. Instead of this being plain user, this should be post.user. So when we save this, we can add another post, and this will be displayed within post list. And then to make this even cleaner, note how much cleaner our component tree is becoming. We can easily take a look at what's being returned here. We have a header, we have a create post component to make our post, and we have a post list. Very simple to read, which is what we want in the end. We want simplicity. We want to make it very easy for ourselves and for other developers to be able to look at our code and see what's happening. To make this even simpler, obviously we want a post list to consist of individual posts, and that's where we're going to use the individual post component. So once again, let's comment out our code that's being returned, and we'll use the post component within post list. Now this is going to be from the same folder, so we can just say /post since we're already in the components folder, and here we want to return post. We'll need to use the key prop again. We'll set that to index, and we want to pass down all of the post data. So we'll make another prop post here, set to post. And once again, we can copy everything that's being returned, what was initially returned from post list. We can put all of this on one line, head into post, and now return. Our fragment, we can remove the key. We can destructure the post prop to get all of our data, and we can now turn the fragment in the longhand syntax, long form, to a shorthand if we like. And now If we try saving everything, we see it all works as before. We see our post list is composed of individual post components. We see their key. We can add as many posts as we like. And to make this even cleaner, we can use a trick with the object spread operator within post list to, instead of getting each property off of our post prop like this and continuing to repeat ourselves by saying post, 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 instead of doing that, we can use a little trick that's possible with the object spread operator. Instead of creating a named prop here and calling it post, we can just directly put an object onto the post component and then spread in all of the properties of the post object that we're getting. So think that we're spreading in as individual props now image, content, and user. So we no longer are receiving post, but we can directly get the properties image, content, and user. So we can remove that reference to the post object. So now, if we save everything, we see it still works as before, but now our code is a lot more declarative with a lot less repetition, and it's even more transparent, the data that we're displaying here. And again, that's thanks to the object spread operator, where we can just directly spread in an object, this has to be an object, to our components. So we've greatly simplified our component tree here within app. It's looking pretty good so far, and we're managing both types of state, user and post state. But note that even with this relatively simple app, there's a lot of props that we're adding to some components we're having to pass down. And these two props, set post and post, bothers me a little bit that we have to pass it down to create post. So what can we do to avoid having to pass both of these values down? If we go into create post, you'll see that we're making this new posts array that we're passing to set post to be updated in the component, in the parent component. And one solution you might have would be to use the updater pattern and to get the previous posts and to spread in all of those previous posts at the end and insert the new one at the beginning instead of having to use this post prop. That would be one solution. But another common solution is to pass down a callback. So instead of doing all of this right here, doing this work to create a new array with the new posts and the old posts and calling the setter function, what if we lifted this up to our parent and instead passed down a callback, since we're quite familiar with doing so in this section? So let's try that. Let's create a function that does what it says. We'll call it handle add post. We want to add a new post. And what is it going to do? Well, it's going to, within create post, accept the new post. So we'll call it here handle add post. It's going to accept the post object for the new post. And when it has that, when it has this new post, it's going to take the existing posts array and we'll do the same operation of spread all of its previous values in at the end and add the new post to the beginning and pass that to our setter function. So we're doing fundamentally the same thing, but just a level up. And this will allow us to simplify the code that we have here and also to not have to pass down this posts array. So we can remove that, and instead of passing down set posts, we'll pass down just handle add post. And again, we'll get rid of posts. So now we want to destructure handle add post instead of set post. I think we did everything that we need to. Let's test this out. So provide some text and an image and hit submit. And this works just fine. So the callback pattern works well. But there's one thing I want you to be aware of, And this might seem a bit confusing at first. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable above the app component, and we'll call this the functions count. And I'm going to set it equal to a set. And a set is a data structure in JavaScript that was added in ES6 that allows us to get a set of data kind of like an array, but only have unique values. It throws out, a set throws out any duplicate values. I'm going to create an additional piece of state called count. This will function as a counter. We'll have a default value of 0. We'll have count variable and setter set count. And we're just going to have a simple button here at the bottom that allows us to increment this count. So we'll display it right here, and when a user clicks on it, we just want to take set count and increment the previous value by 1. Note that you don't need to implement this yourself. This is just for the sake of demonstration. And then I'm going to go to my console. Oh, and one additional step. We're going to take this functions count, this set, and every time our component re-renders, we're going to try to add to it functions count.add. We want to add handle add post. And then we'll console log the number of functions that we have stored here. So right now on the initial render, we have one function. We have one version of handle add post. And let's see what happens when we increment this count. We have 2 functions now, then 3, then 4. So what's happening here? Well, every time state updates, every time our app re-renders, this handle add post callback that we're passing down to create post is being recreated. This isn't something we need to worry about too much here because we don't have something like a count that's changing state that much. But if we were to expand our feed and added other bits of functionality, we might be updating our app state quite a lot. So we do need to care about the performance when we pass down a callback of that callback function being recreated. And how do we fix that? How do we prevent this from being recreated unnecessarily? Well, we use the use callback hook. So to use callback, we can move the name handle add post. We can rewrite this as an arrow function, and we'll pass it to use callback, and we'll set the return value, the memoized callback, to handle add post, the variable handle add post, and we can still use it just like we did before with the same reference. But to the second value, we need to tell use callback when do we need to recreate this function. When something changes, when do we need to actually create this function and execute it? Well, we want to do that when our posts change, when our posts array changes. So now when we save app.js, on our initial render we get handle add post, but since we're now passing in this arrow function, it doesn't have a name. However, when we increment the counter, we get a re-render and we get our console log, yes, but we see that the number of values added to the set stays at 1. So this is a visual example of how use callback works. It might have been a little bit mysterious to you up until this point, but here we can see the benefit that no matter how many times state is updated with a different value, we're only going to have that function recreated whenever some piece of data that matters to it is changed. For example, when we add a post. So only in that instance will the function be recreated and run.